There's a lot of subsidization going into the wrong areas. We're basically taxing electricity really heavily while taxing gas quite cheaply. So the average person just gets really frustrated. They're seeing the news of everything's more expensive for me, and that's being blamed on wind farms and solar and EVs. And God, you want me to have a heat pump, but that's too challenging. So I think we've lost the narrative a little bit, and I think a lot of average people are kind of fighting it.
Welcome back to In Between Charges, the perfect podcast to listen to whilst waiting for your EV to charge. As always, I am joined by my co-host, Kevin Spangenberg. Very happy to have you back in the studio. Welcome back to Copenhagen, where you've traded flip-flops for rain pants and warm beanie caps. So how's that transition been and what's new?
It's cold, Mike. It's cold. It's good to be back, but it's cold. I'm struggling to find my gloves in my apartment, so I've been biking in with cold hands. I did find my beanie, so my head is fine. But yeah, a little different environment than Miami. But glad to be back, glad to be in studio with you, and looking forward to today's conversation.
That's hilarious. You've lost your gloves, yeah. So you just
I did. I lost my gloves.
You've gone from Metro Man to you're braving the blizzard. All right. This month, we are joined for the second time by Ryan Fisher, the head of charging infrastructure at BloombergNEF. It is a first for us on this podcast with a returning guest, and we're super excited to have him join us again. Hot off the back of the BNEF Summit in San Francisco, covering all sorts of topics with EVs and EV charging, whether it's pricing, fleet electrification, hardware industry outlooks, as well as EV adoption as an overall topic. And if you haven't read any of his articles yet, we would highly recommend you do so to stay up to date on all things charging. So, Ryan, excited to have you on the show. Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Nice to be back.
Great. So we wanted to talk to you about a couple of things today. One is understanding a little bit the automaker's role in the charging industry, taking a bit of a pulse check on the outlook for EV adoption, and then also some other topics related to hardware and infrastructure and how you see the industry developing. But let's start with the first one. So recently you hosted a talk together with IONNA and also ChargeScape. You were joined by the CEOs of both companies, Seth Cutler and Joseph Malone. And both of these businesses, for those who aren't familiar, are joint ventures between a few different of the world's foremost automakers. IONNA, the company I mentioned at the start, is a fast charging network that's rolling out a few different sites in the US and is the kind of counterpart to the European equivalent of IONNITY. And what stood out for me and also Kevin, we were chatting a bit about this morning, was how these direct competitors, usually at loggerheads against each other, competing for consumers, competing for space, have now somehow managed to forego this. They've somehow managed to set aside their differences for the benefit of the industry and consumers in bringing reliable, fast charging to their drivers. They've pulled their deep pockets, their precious cash to help basically encourage collective demand. But this is, let's be honest, a very different business and a very different business model. Instead of trading vehicles, they're trading electricity, and the margins are very different. Whilst improving, they're not the same as the margins that you should be able to achieve with EVs, particularly as battery prices go down into the future. So, Ryan, can you help shed some light on that discussion and what you took from how companies and automakers are fitting EV charging and EV charging networks into their strategies?
Yeah, the US is interesting because there's obviously a couple of the automakers going alone as well. Mercedes has this venture where they're going to install a lot of chargers, and that's not just in the US. I think they're going to do some of that in China and Europe as well. VW is doing some stuff on its own. Obviously, IONNITY was the sort of first major public charging network that they backed with big money. And that's been pretty successful when you think of how many chargers they've got across Europe and where they've been. When IONNA was originally announced, we did a piece looking at the impacts it could have and where it was. I just remember thinking, why did it take them so long to do this? And maybe it's fundamentally that they didn't need to sell any electric cars in the US before, and then suddenly they realize they're going to have to. Fuel economy targets kind of coming in and other issues. Obviously, flip-flopping presidents over there between Trump and the Obama era and then Trump and the Biden era have changed what's happening a little bit more so than in Europe, where we have actually had some reasonably common trajectory. Obviously, we'll come on to how that's changing. So I think if you're going to sell EVs, you can kind of see with Tesla, with the supercharger network, you're probably going to have some chargers, and they've realized that if you want to do that at scale in the right locations early enough, you might have to put money in yourself to guarantee that experience. So that's one of the major things. And what I took out of that interview actually was there's a lot going on in the US at the moment, but it was quite impressive how quickly IONNA has rolled these out. I think it was 12 months and they've already got 6 sites up and running, which is pretty impressive.
But you kind of alluded to it there a little bit, is how Mercedes, I believe, is a part of the IONNA coalition or joint venture, right? But then they also are doing something with ChargePoint. I think it was GM that also had a big announcement at the end of the year with ChargePoint. We kind of see this kind of multi-pronged approach, or these companies that are kind of spreading their bets a little bit, where it doesn't seem like they're all in on one. They just know that the infrastructure in the US is lacking. So let's do something with Pilot. Let's do something with ChargePoint. Let's do something with IONNA a little bit. Whereas here in Europe, you're right, there was Ionity, but then it's kind of gone the route of standalone businesses that are now charging networks. They're somewhat grown-up businesses, right, that have figured out how to, some of them become profitable, but they're not really related to the automakers whatsoever. So is it just really this kind of lack of infrastructure over there? These automakers are like, look, if we need to sell electric vehicles, this infrastructure thing that we were hoping to be taken care of by third-party players is just not getting there. And we need to spread our bets and invest in a lot of these things without an understanding yet of who's really going to emerge. And let's just make sure that we get as many kind of irons in the fire as we can going forward.
In Europe, there's just been such an amount of rollout, particularly of these like ultra fast chargers, if we concentrate on that market, from retailers, supermarkets, oil and gas majors, utilities, like you name it, they probably put them in the ground. Whereas in the US, it's largely just Tesla and hardly anybody else has really done anything. So I can see GM making relationships with the likes of Pilot and EVgo and some of the others they've done. It's probably pretty good in shaping what you want the network to be. Like that money's going to go in, you're a bit cautious, it's not quite going right. Let's add a bit and shape what others are doing to seed the market than having to do it all yourself. So I can see that they've had to kind of spread strategies. I'm not 100% sure why the US, other than not having as many vehicles, has not seen much investment appetite. I think it's probably coming. We did a piece recently looking in California at Electrify America's network, and I'm trying to give a baseline for people who wouldn't be as familiar with the numbers, but I think a lot of the chargers, about 200 kilowatt hours a day now, they had something like 40% or more of their chargers delivering 600 kilowatt hours a day on their California network, like just huge amounts. So other companies have got to be looking at utilization rising and what that means for business cases, and then jumping in and following some of what's happened in Europe. The other one was we were kind of looking at the end of year numbers in Europe. And I think at the end of 2023, there was about 65 to 70,000 of these ultra fast chargers. This is Europe, including the UK. And then by the end of last year, there was something like 118,000. So it wasn't doubling, but it was a lot. We almost did more in 2024 than had ever existed, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So that investment question is kind of interesting, because then you wonder, as automakers or just investors are starting to see that utilization tick up, then they're like, their ears perk up, right? There's an opportunity here, right? Whereas 5 years ago, that utilization was not there. But then you start to see these numbers from Electrify America, from EVgo, and then you start to say, okay, there's an opportunity here. But do you get the sense that the automakers are in it to make a lot of money off this? Or is this more, we just know the infrastructure is still not there and the end game is we want to sell more electric vehicles? Or do you kind of get the sense that, oh, maybe this could grow into something? We know the supercharger business is a pretty profitable little business on its own for Tesla, right?
One thing Seth was talking about was the emergence of digitization and how that meets the physical. Automakers are pretty used to their own little piece, and they've obviously had problems with software, and they sell a car in a dealership. They've looked at how they can sell it other ways. But charging is getting into a different aspect of consumers' lives, whether that's charging at home or other areas. And at first, I think they were probably quite cautious, and now they probably realize they both need to embrace it to sell the cars, but also there's some opportunity there. They talked about it for a while, not necessarily done loads, but there is an opportunity. How much relationship do I actually have with my utility or my oil and gas major? Pretty much zero. Not that I have loads with the automaker, but you can see that you buy a car, maybe you do download the app for the car and it links in. So then they have an in to sell you energy and sell other things. I can see that growing.
A little bit more brand loyalty to a car company than your utility company, I imagine, right?
Yeah, but then even so, with the charging network for Ionity and IONNA, it's not glaringly obvious that when you're buying a BMW, you're also getting access to a very strong network in the US, especially because IONNA doesn't have a mobile app. Anyone can go up there and charge and pay with their card or whatever on a payment terminal. And so it's kind of maybe kind of going into what you're saying, Ryan, the benefit for an auto manufacturer is perhaps multiple things. One of them is it's an R&D investment, because at the moment their software in their vehicles needs to be up to scratch to the same capability as Tesla. We need to have plug and charge. It's like an investment for them to be able to make the charging experience great. And then maybe the longer term goal is trying to get closer to utilities or oil and gas to be able to get preferential prices for their EV drivers. But a lot of it doesn't at the moment point towards a profit generating or a high margin business for auto manufacturers, particularly when profit margins for their current EV sales are already pretty slim. And as we know, operating a charging network with a margin is already pretty tough to do. You can count on one hand or maybe one finger in Europe, right? And then trying to kind of work out what the end game is for an auto manufacturer. Maybe the end game is we'll do this for 10 years and then we'll sell it out or outsource it, or maybe offer out parts of the business to other operators where this is their core practice. And then we can just sail away into the sunset with fantastic margins and big sales for our vehicles. Or it could be...
I don't think they're going to admit that.
Yeah.
I can't remember where I asked Seth that question, but they're not going to, you starting a business, maybe you are all in, you need your team to be all in.
Yeah.
Like saying we're going to sell in 10 years. It wouldn't surprise me if that happened. A lot of this is a commodity. The electricity price isn't at the moment, and we see huge variations. But over time, it probably will be when you go to the chargers, there's some type of commoditization. But I do think the valuable element of like plug and charge is pretty big. You've got somebody's payment details in the car, and you as the automaker can build things on top of that. So I think that is a good in. Fundamentally, a lot of people aren't going to buy if there's not a network. So that's an important step. There was one other thing that kind of came up around where these stations were going to be that Seth said, which was like urban areas. So a lot of IONNITY was about connecting highways, whereas it's not necessarily everything that IONNA was doing. And I think that's important because a lot of people are based in urban areas. Maybe they don't have a home charger, and I think that feeds demand. And I can imagine that does change the business model. The other one that comes up for any of these companies, and it's not just the automakers, a fuel retailer makes probably 25% of revenues from selling goods in stores, 50% of profit. So that kind of relationship will exist in charging. And then you've got huge swathes of companies with no retailers. So when you point to Fastned, they're obviously now looking at what is their retail offering to go with it. But not every CPO is doing that.
We've talked about this before on this, but the margins right now anyway, the margins can be decent on the electricity. Whereas the margins have been reduced to just a few cents per gallon or something, or per liter of petrol or gas at gas stations. Whereas right now you look at the margins on Fastned and some of the publicly traded companies, and the margins, they can be 10, 20, 30 cents per kilowatt hour that they're making. And we see that with our own operators and everything. But again, does that persist? Does that get driven down when consumers become aware that this kilowatt should not cost me 40 cents or 50 cents? I know that kind of thing. Or can they persist with those margins because you're just going to take what you can get when you're a driver and you're really in a position to shop around as much? But in more advanced markets like in Denmark, there is quite a bit of pricing competition, right? It's been driven down quite a bit lower. You pull off in certain areas of the country and you do have 3 different network options of where to charge your EV, right? Whereas in the US, it's pretty early right now. It's like you don't have IONNA versus Shell. When you pull off a ramp, you're probably in most places not going to have those options, and you're going to be a price taker in that case.
And Fastned has basically gone for locations like that. So you're seeing the difference between the company who hasn't got the best locations and company who's like on the motorways in the key places, like say, is a price taker.
Yeah. So what are you going to do? You're going to pull off and not go charge at Fastned? And it's like, oh, well, they don't have the best amenities in the world. Like, they're building out some new amenities, but you're like, nah, they don't have my Starbucks or whatever it is. Like, I'm not going there. Like, you're going there. That's your option.
Yeah, I think maybe all consumer surveys at the moment in Europe anyway, I think price is steadily ticking up, but it's still not in the top 3 of most important things. It's just convenience and location. But maybe we'll start to see that change because, as you say, it's like if you go any site, there are usually 2 or 3 sites nearby, particularly within urban areas where you can charge. Maybe you're not going to get the fast chargers. Maybe you have to go somewhere slower. And so as a result, you can shop around for price without risking your battery running dead because it's over the road or around the corner, right? Whereas in the US, it's a very different approach.
Yeah.
We have seen that trend, though, you mentioned, Kevin, where the price is going down in more so Scandinavian markets. Interestingly, also Florida, I think, came up.
Really?
Yeah, Norway, Denmark, we see the price go down. In pretty much every other region, the price is going up.
It's going up right now.
Yeah, we see it rising. UK is pretty bad as a market compared to all the others. They've had some changes in how the grid fees are paid, which seems to be one of the narratives as to why that's feeding in. Arguably, you could say they want to make more, you're a bit of a price taker and you're probably more likely to take it when you're paying 6p per kilowatt hour at home. You're saving a load of money anyway, and that one-off time you've got to charge in public is expensive. You probably go, it evens out.
Yeah, and I guess also if people aren't price sensitive, you can slowly tweak up and people are still going to go there if it's a charging site that people recognize and people look for. Can you maybe, Ryan, help us understand a little bit more what you're seeing in other markets, why prices are going up? Is it an attempt for operators to try to demonstrate more profitability? Is it because they're looking for more funding now, so their kind of current cash runway is running out and they need to be able to float for the next few years? What's coming up for you?
Yeah, I thought there was a bit of a storm in the media, obviously, about EV sales were not growing as fast, which comes into a headline about EV sales are declining, or what, like the perception was probably worse than the reality, but that does feed to boardrooms. And I think the investors were then pushing down a bit on the companies to show performance metrics that they probably weren't meeting. So then one way to do that is to rise prices. And if you rise them and you lose less custom, but you make more profit or more profit than the amount of custom you lost, then you're probably likely to stick with it. So I think there's probably some of that playing into it, as well as just, like I say, dynamics around grid fees. We saw that play into some of the numbers on Fastnet. So their operating costs per charger were actually going down in every year. And then last year you started to see them go up, and they said that was due to grid fees as well. Obviously, it depends where on your balance book you put stuff. But yeah, that one was to do with grid fees.
Okay, interesting. And grid fees being what, permitting costs, or just they don't have a PPA or a power purchase agreement in place, for example, so they can't guarantee the tariff?
100% sure how it all works, because in your electricity bill, usually you've got like the price of energy, the price of using the grid. I suppose if you're buying like some of these companies where some of it's hedged, maybe they're still buying some of it real time. I don't know whether the grid fee, how exactly that is paid in those scenarios, but I think it's that bit, like your usage of the grid is what I think they're referring to.
Interesting. One thing just related to kind of business models, something we've touched on, it's not necessarily a big thing in Europe, but it is something that we've seen. Kevin's had some conversations with businesses in Canada, for example. Carbon credits is something that's used very frequently. The carbon credit market within the US is much more mature, and we're starting to have some discussions, particularly in Germany, where there is some sort of credit scheme, LCFS. How have you started to see that play a role in these charging networks? How high in their priority list is it for them currently?
Most people say it's quite low.
Okay.
But when you look at the numbers, it's probably like 5-10% of revenues for some of them where the markets exist. So it is quite important. The schemes are all changing. So the LCFS, I think, can also be talked about in the sense of the German scheme as well, had problems where the price, say, was reasonably high. People make their business case based on a certain price of these credits, and then the price slowly goes down. And a lot of that was to do with not just excess biofuels, but it does seem like there was a lot of biofuels coming in. So the LCFS, with a Californian scheme, has basically been looking at, they changed the legislation recently, at different ways of cutting out things like crop-based biofuels and stuff like that. The EU, where Germany had the same thing happen and the credit price tanked, has been looking at issues with the importation of Chinese biofuels, where basically people were saying, oh, it's not regulated well enough. There's issues whether people can actually know whether the certification is correct. Like, is it what they say it is? So they've been trying to legislate out the Chinese ones and get rid of what maybe could be fake certifications to keep their credit prices high. A couple of things that we're watching, not all schemes are the same. One of them in the LCFS is around who gets the residential charging credit. So before, I think it basically went to utilities who could make programs. And in this new upgrade, they were discussing about giving a portion of it to the automakers. So that then was interesting. And I think what they then did was actually change it to say the money should go to commercial vehicle charger stations, to like charging rollout for trucks and stuff. So it's quite interesting. It was dynamic and changing. In Germany, I think as a driver, you can like sign it, and there's a lot of companies who will like aggregate some of these credits, and you maybe get a couple of €100 a year or something. So it's not nothing. But we're watching in Europe that the RED III said every EU state should have one of these schemes. So we're watching how they roll them out. The difficulty is that each country will probably roll out a slightly different version, which then becomes incredibly complicated from an admin perspective. So yeah, we're looking into that.
Yeah, very interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in Europe, and I guess whether it plays a bigger role with network providers. As you said, if we can get the model right and the price isn't massively inflating how much of a support this will give, and then you have to kind of steadily fund the cash from somewhere else, 5 to 10% of income can help you to set up a load new sites or help you to kind of hire new people. And I think
they're all subject to lobbying, right?
Yeah.
So the California thing was all about, well, it's going to increase the price of gasoline. That goes to individual consumer. And we obviously model, and we have models that people can download on our site that say, like, here is our outlook for biofuels. Here is our outlook for each type of those and the different fuels that are going in. Here's our outlook for electricity and what we think is going to happen on like the amount of gasoline put on the market and how that changes or could potentially change those different pricings. But yeah, if you basically making these people putting gasoline on the market pay more, they're going to lobby against it. They're going to try and lobby against it.
That's
so
true.
Interesting scenarios where like Shells and BPs of this world are doing both. They're obviously doing charging, they're selling fuel, and they'll be on either side of this coin. But when we've looked at this before, it is noticeable how you can change subtext within the legislation and it can drastically change the output as to who's winning and who's losing. So we'll keep an eye on that.
Interesting. Who's winning and who's losing in terms of charging share, kilowatt hours traded, or number of sites? Or?
Maybe like the fairness of the system and like how much emissions are really being set. It's all based on emissions, like a ton of emissions, and then how much is the credit price worth on that and what gets traded. One of the things we didn't discuss on your first question, which semi-links to this, is telematics. So the automakers have more control of the telematics than others. So they can then record or control your charging at home through that. And obviously ChargeGate, which was the venture of several automakers in the US, is looking to do it.
Yeah.
What you're seeing on smart charging so far is people control through the charger, and then they maybe use third parties who can do things on the car as well at the same time. Maybe they want to know state of charge or state of health or whatever it is they want to know about the battery to get more control. But the automakers don't like this, so they're sort of like suing and blocking these third parties who give them control so they can do it themselves. And again, it's another in. If you go through them, they can make more money. They can control some of the network. One of the other things that was said, I think it maybe was in the pre-meet, was that not everybody has a charger. And we don't know what the number is either. I'd be intrigued if you guys know. A lot of the start was, 80% of people charge at home and they buy a home charger. What they're saying in the US is a lot of people have tumble dryer sockets in the garage, and the tumble dryer socket actually might be both higher voltage, but the ampage is also quite high. So I plug in my garage, I'm only really going to get 3 kilowatt from it. Whereas in the US, because the current is higher, with that voltage, you can get 7 kilowatt out of it. So without having a charger, you can get quite a high rate of charge. So then I suppose what they're saying is, well, there's a certain part of the market we can control, even if they don't have a charger. And that's why there's an advantage to us doing it as well.
Yeah. When we're looking at the market and we're trying to do market sizing, we take a big chunk out from a lot of residential chargers who are just going to be plugging in and just letting that go, basically, rather than setting up an individual charge point. And there's also a lot of people who will plug a charge point but never connect it to the internet, because all they need is the fuse breaker and making sure that it passes regulations, and then they can charge. And that's all they're kind of interested in, right?
Yeah. I'm involved in some Reddit threads right now. There's a vibrant Reddit community over in the US of people like taking a photo of their thing and they're like, what do I need here? And then they're like, every other day there's someone's like, do I need a smart charger? Do I need to spend $500 on this? Yes or no? And people are like, nah, you're fine. Just get that dryer socket hooked up. And then my parents bought one and they don't have a smart charger and it works fine, And so then these hardware companies are trying to like sell the benefits of that. It's going to be safer. Maybe you're going to get faster charging. You're going to get some cool Wi-Fi features, grid balancing, et cetera. But a lot of people are just like, nah, I'm just going to plug that in and call it good. But then that's where the automakers are like, there's an opportunity there, because then we can get involved there and kind of cut out the wall boxes of the world, right? We were talking about the summit you were at in San Francisco, Ryan, and there's the nice panel that you moderated, and there's a couple of optimistic chaps up there on stage speaking about their charging business and everything. But maybe it was the next day or the day before, right? And there's an executive order that's getting rid of NEVI funds or pausing it. And so I guess I just was kind of noting the dichotomy a little bit, right? Where you hear like IONNA plowing ahead and a lot of these things, but then of course there's a lot coming out from the administration. We don't have to talk all politics and everything, but maybe could you talk about the sentiment there a little bit, maybe in the side halls and side chats and everything, where it's just a mood in the industry a little bit, right? Where there's companies that still see an opportunity, but then there's also some companies that are maybe seeing their funds yanked, and a lot of uncertainty that's been created with the incoming administration.
Yeah, obviously you've got some companies who rely on government funding and they're going to have more problems, and then you've got companies who don't. So there's a Florida network, OBE Power, and I was talking to their CEO, and I'm not first, I make commercial contracts. If we can get it, maybe that's good. But they're not relying on NEVI funding, for example. This company is doing like hotels and retailers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
One of the ones that was like optimistic, and I felt framed some of it, is that they had GM's battery lead. He's called Kurt Kelty, and he was on stage. And he was basically saying, like, you got to stay the course. We don't, as a big corporation, invest hundreds of millions in something and then suddenly flip it based on an executive order. Like, no doubt there might be some recalibration in the longer term, is probably what I would say coming out. But he was framing like, look, we're doing positive things. We've like lowered the battery cost by 60 kilowatt hour last year. We're going to lower another 30 kilowatt hour this year. That's $6,000 out of the truck. They're bringing more models. It's not just them as well. And that fundamentally is what changes the market. It's like what models are available. The caution is where you've got some of those based on the tariffs saying, we're not going to do what we said we were going to do. So definitely negative sides to it, but a lot of positive things. And one of the things that Seth said, but I think is reflected in those Electrify America numbers, is there's just not enough charging in the US today to support the vehicles that are already there. And like once the private companies start getting in, I think you'll see what we've seen in Europe, which is like a bit of a bun fight for space and locations. And
yeah. What do you think it'll take to incentivize those businesses to get started, particularly now? I guess they need to be able to see that people are really interested in buying battery electric vehicles.
Yeah, there's a lot of money flowing into areas where you can guarantee the utilization, where there's less merchant risk, then they're kind of in. And we've seen, I don't know, like Terawatt raised $1 billion. That's real money. That's quite a lot. And we've seen quite a lot of those other companies, Volterra, I think is another one, in the US, where they can put money in because they know what's happening in terms of whether the chargers will be used. Prologis Mobility was there as well. Prologis is kind of one of those companies maybe you have heard of them. A couple of years ago, I had never heard of them. And then you look and you're like, oh, wow, these are like one of the biggest companies in the world. And they hold huge amounts of retail space. I think they got the number 2 on the rooftop solar suppliers in the US because all of these logistics facilities, they put it on. So then it becomes like, how can we make it TCO parity with diesel, for example, for their suppliers? And when they can, great, because they're kind of selling them something else that they weren't before. So they seem to have some quite positive stories. Obviously, it works better in regions with trucks that are being subsidized.
Yeah. A lot of those, the Volterras, the Terawatts of the world, a lot of them are in California, where there is pretty aggressive fleet electrification regulation and laws that have been passed. So they can more accurately model usage, right? They have a pretty good idea of how many trucks there are going to be on the road, and they know that that's going to be steadily increasing, right? So they get these properties and they're able to kind of like at least have a pretty reasonable forecast or outlook on what that's going to look like in the coming years. I think it was after Trump was elected that you reduced your forecast for adoption in the US, but maybe globally, I forget. But I know you have a secret sauce and a really, nice formula and everything that you've got a lot of analysts working on there and everything. But what was kind of the core driver there when you lowered that for 2030? Is it just, there are a lot of different variables now? Is it the tax credit? Is it the infrastructure spending? Is it all of the above? Can you explain a little bit There's
an element of all the above, but the main one is fuel economy standards. Like if you guts the fuel economy standards, then you've got less pressure on the automakers to do stuff. I don't think we had many assumptions around California changing at this point, and the head of CARB is kind of saying like we're going to fight it. Like it doesn't just change legislation overnight.
Yeah.
So we haven't changed California yet, I don't think.
It's interesting you say the fuel economy standards, and it's exactly the same that we're starting to see with some of the conversations and discussions over the pond in Europe. The ACEA is the automobile lobbying company are trying to push back the CO2 emissions regulations so that there's not the 5-year aggressive step change up to 2035 and beyond. I guess you're also maybe closely watching this in Europe at the moment, depending on what happens with the German election. It'll probably be Friedrich Merz's party that comes in. And one of their, pillars or policies has been pushing back the ban on combustion engine sales from 2035 to 2045. So starting to see some of that discussion emerge as well as auto manufacturers under immense pressure to try to hit these goals and maybe struggling to do so.
Yeah, Alex O'Donovan runs our EV stuff, and somebody in her team called Shan, he wrote a piece looking specifically at the European regulations. And some companies have got a much harder task than others. Volkswagen is the biggest one, and when you look at the analysis, it sort of suggests that they could account for as much as 50% of the fine. Now, the fine is always a difficult one. Obviously, in the media, some of them say, the fine's going to be 15 billion. Well, the reality is there's measures that they take to do it, and they're also probably going to sell more cars next year anyway. They knew this was coming. Whether or not they're now thinking, oh, God, we're not going to meet it, they had a plan. Like, you can see it with the vehicles coming out, so they're trying to cut back. Then you see different automakers saying they can meet it as well. So I think Renault CEO came out and said, yeah, we think we could probably make it recently. One of them in there is Toyota. So Toyota actually, because they're not got super heavy cars and because they got quite a lot of hybridization, whilst they're not selling hardly any EVs, actually, when you think about it first, they're going to do terribly. But actually, because they got lighter cars, hybridization, they don't do too badly, whereas some of them need a big jump. So we're looking at pooling, where they pool together with people who are lower than the emission standard because they're selling all BEVs. We're looking at what they're saying. We're sort of looking at what ASEA wants, so the association in Europe. I think they've come out and said something like, we want the top 10% of polluting cars to not count. And I think they also discussed changing how the compliance is measured from like a year to a 5-year average. So there's quite a few interesting stories going on there. I mean, the derogation, when I used to work at Jaguar Land Rover, they had a derogation because of being below a certain volume of sales, I think. But they knew that that was coming to an end, or they were going to go higher volume than it. And then it was similar discussions. It is interesting to see how it's changing. But I think maybe there will be some changes in the legislation, but I suspect that it won't be quite as dramatic as has been told in the media. I think they're saying 16 billion and we want everything to change.
Yeah.
But certainly you don't want to be fining your companies when they're struggling already, and then giving the automakers an opportunity to come in, when at the same time they're also putting tariffs on the Chinese automakers. So, I mean, the European legislators have got a very complicated problem.
One of the things they're talking about spreading out the credits that they have if they overshoot also by a period of 5 years. So they're effectively on loan, that right? So some of the manufacturers don't have to pay the fine straight away. They can, as long as they meet the standards next year and the year after, they can kind of average them out. Yeah, if they overshoot it by what they have currently.
We've seen the EU, one of the other things we were looking at was they do centralized funding for chargers. They put in about 1.7 billion in about the last 5 years into infrastructure as a whole. I think the chargers is probably about 1 billion, and it accounted for something like, I want to say it was 90 euros per BEV, but they're still putting money into hydrogen. And looking at the numbers, I've done it before and I had a quick look before I came in here. It was about 90,000 euros per hydrogen vehicle they've put in. It's just an insane amount of money. We don't just see it in Europe, we see it in California as well. One of the things they definitely switched to, though, is commercial trucking. So last round, they put huge amounts of money into commercial trucking. Milence was a winner, BP was a winner, and some of that is the multi-megawatt standard. So the EU has noticed that actually we've got a market that's kind of working for passenger vehicles. Let's put our money into commercial vehicles, which need a bit of propping up.
Yeah, we were speaking with, it reminds me, we were speaking with Lucy Matera from Charge Up Europe, who was explaining their kind of thresholds. And when sales hit a certain volume, or when the vehicles on the road hit a certain volume, they basically then pause funding and move on to the next category of vehicle class. And, you know, in a few markets in Europe, we're starting to really hit very strong and sustained sales volumes.
Oh. Could we shift gears here a little bit then? Ryan, one of the pieces that you wrote recently appeared in Hyperdrive. We're avid readers of Hyperdrive. I think always look forward to when your name's there at the top, maybe once a week or so, once every other week.
Maybe more like once a month, I think.
Once a month? Okay. Well, a couple times recently.
Maybe I did a few recently.
Yeah, a couple of hit ones.
But one of the ones we were like was your examination of the hardware prices and the decreasing price for DC fast charging infrastructure. But you kind of noted that it's a little bit of a kind of a gloomy state right now for some of them, right? This price has been going down, but you know, you have Kempower, that stock price has plunged 80%. We know they've had some layoffs recently. You look at maybe the Wallbox share price that's there on notice by NASDAQ. They might have to delist here upcoming. A lot of these hardware companies are struggling. E-mobility is having a little bit of a difficult time. So it's good in one sense that the price of this is going down. So infrastructure becomes a little bit more feasible for a wider variety of entities. But then on the other hand, these are businesses that are trying to make this work, right? And turn a profit and build a successful hardware business. So should we, when I read that, Mike and I were discussing this, should we read more into this as like and be concerned in some sort of way? Or is this kind of the natural cycle of technological development and some businesses are going to succeed, some are going to fail, and that's kind of the way things go? Or is there something a little bit more on your mind when you think about these declining prices and difficulties that the hardware manufacturers are facing?
I think there's a natural cycle, some of them bringing out new technology. You've obviously mentioned like Wallbox, ChargePoint. A lot of the money goes into the DC fast chargers. And whilst they're starting to do that, and you see how their revenues for that portion of their segment have gone up quite quickly, they were not necessarily there that early, and therefore they're kind of fighting to get market share in the bigger bit. AC charging is like, I don't want to say anyone can do it, but like there's an element of like lots of companies can make this, and therefore that becomes hard from a cost perspective. Across the industry, you've sort of seen companies scale up, and because there's so many companies, they're all chasing the same market. And then in a channel basis, some of them have got stuff in warehousing. I think we'll see that next year as well for some of the companies. But not everybody has been unsuccessful. I mean, we pointed out about Alpatronic. I think they were over €1 billion in revenue last year. Pretty impressive numbers. The big threat really is China. So obviously the price has been dropping. Chinese companies look like they're up to 60% lower than the average that we had. So not even the highest, but the average, then you have some of them up to 60% lower. Well, interestingly, where you've got rid of the NEVI grant in the US, the NEVI grant in the US had requirements for Build in America well, if you haven't got to build in America anymore to get the grant and there's no extra funding, well, I might as well not build my factory in America and I might as well just send it in. Well, if the tariff is 35% and I'm 60% cheaper, well, I might as well ship it in. So in some ways, you might see the opposite of what they wanted to happen because of that. Like, they're all on about building in America and like, oh, we want to get rid of this by increasing tariffs, but maybe they didn't increase it enough just on the charging industry. I think there was caution about using these Chinese suppliers for a while, but I think people are starting to realize actually they're doing a good job. I mean, they're obviously serving huge amounts of vehicles in China already, and they're capable of both providing quality stuff. So yeah, competition is big.
Competition it's huge. Like, our integrations team are working with, I got this number, we were talking about it last year, over 150 new brands integrated, and a lot of them are white label variations of various manufacturers out from Shenzhen. And I guess the challenge that they've had is trying to meet the OCPP standards. But once they're there, these charge points are performing pretty well and at a very, very cost competitive level too. And if you're a new business trying to step in, it's a no-brainer, right? Relative to some of the other charge points that are 50 grand, 60 grand plus.
You just don't hear it as a thing in China that it doesn't work. And it doesn't, like, getting Chinese news is slightly harder than it is in other regions like Europe and US, where it pops up every day. But yeah, they don't seem to be in quite the state that we are with reliability issues.
You visited Shenzhen recently, right? What was your experience? Was it Shenzhen you were where in China?
Yeah, I was in Shenzhen. God, there's just cars everywhere, EVs everywhere. The thing that is so shocking is, like, you've never even heard of these brands and they've got a car that looks really good flying around. There's so much going on in terms of the automotive supply chain. I think somebody said to me, like, oh yeah, if your nan wanted to start an auto company here, she could. There's so much going on. It's pretty cool. You see a lot of automaker stations, but price, I think, was one that came into it, where you'd see like some stations very close to each other, some not so used, and then another one that's cheaper and it's stacked out. That dynamic was quite interesting. Yeah, China was something else.
We're at the end of February right now, and this will probably release a week or two into March, right, and everything. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on like what you're watching the most in 2025. But in our industry, kind of what are you really keeping, like one or two things that you're really keeping your eye on the most this year?
Yeah, we're always trying to build tools and research that may be slightly ahead of what people are reading. So one of them is storage and charging. So we haven't seen loads of it. Some places have it. It seems to be based on the rates. So what we're trying to build is more extensive databasing of the rates, the electricity rates that are available and what are the grid fees that are associated, and then build more models that can say both the economics of the stations, but also whether having storage or not will matter. I mean, we've seen California is the big one where there seems to be like truck charging stations and they've got 5 megawatt hour of storage and stuff like that. And I think Electrify America said something like 25% of their stations in California had storage. So we're kind of trying to work in that space. And then the other thing we talked about was residential charging. We've managed to build quite a lot of transparency around the price of hardware, the public charging. We've not done so much. It's just difficult on residential charging to get loads of solid data. So we're going to spend a bit more time to really try and light up that market a bit more than it is.
On the residential, do you have clients that want this information and try to understand that space a bit more? Or you just know that this is where the majority of charging is taking place, so we just really want to get a firm understanding of what's going on there?
Yeah, we have loads of clients. Like BNEF, traditionally, utilities are obviously pretty big and a lot of demand is going to come from residential charging.
Yeah.
But we're pretty hot on that. We kind of have a lot of data on how much is being used, but we don't have necessarily so much on how the hardware manufacturers are doing, who's got the most market share, what are the channels that it's going through.
Yeah.
The rates, again, is interesting. Obviously, some markets, the rates are quite easy to find. Some of them, they're not. That also just plays into, like, is it cheaper than gasoline?
Yeah.
I gave a presentation at the summit and I had a chart for PG&E. PG&E is the utility where we were based in San Francisco. And the off-peak rate was kind of what you expect. It's less than the state average electricity rate by quite a bit. And that's less than gasoline. It's 2019. But you play it forward until today, and the off-peak electricity rate is more than the average state electricity for PG&E, and it's gaining on gasoline. Depending on whether you look at the metered or unmetered version of it, it's already superseded gasoline. So, yeah, we were kind of like looking at that, trying to figure out where those prices change, how it links to consumers having solar and things like storage at home as well.
Oh, very, very interesting. Seth gave you quite a clear answer that IONNA is not investing in storage at the moment, which I thought was also quite interesting, particularly given what they're trying to achieve now, right?
Yeah, focus seems to be the, like, we want to get them in. And they've done it. I mean,
get some charges in the ground.
They've done, I think, pretty similar numbers of sites to the whole NEVI program in less time,
which I never thought of until I just said it.
I guess, Ryan, for the second time, you will be the first to go through this or break from tradition in our podcast. But you've already answered the question about if you wanted to bust a myth, what would it be? So, I mean, through all of your research, through all of your conversations, the panels that you've hosted and people that you've spoken with, you know, there is a lot of positive sentiment towards EVs, but there's equally quite a lot of challenge around whether this is the powertrain of the future and the impact that it will have on the grid and electrification. I mean, if you were to call something out as keeping you up at night right now, what is that in relation to this industry?
It's a good question. It's a hard one. I'm going to just go with something that's like more anecdotal. My friend messaged, he said, I've got a PHEV. My work, it's 50 quid a month. Or something ridiculously cheap because of the tax rates in the UK. I said, you're going to get a charger? He said, oh, no, I'm not going to get a charger. They pay for my fuel. So the one thing that kind of maybe personal, but also from an analytical perspective is there's a lot of subsidization going into the wrong areas, whether that be things like the PHEVs like I'm describing there that have been studied reasonably regularly and shown that people don't use them and the emissions are higher, or just simplistically things like the gas price in the UK at least. Like we're basically taxing electricity really heavily while taxing gas quite cheaply. So the average person just gets really frustrated. They're seeing the news of everything's more expensive for me, and that's being blamed on wind farms and solar and EVs, and God, you want me to have a heat pump, but that's too challenging. So I think we've lost the narrative a little bit, and I think a lot of average people are kind of fighting it. So maybe that isn't as specific and analytical as you maybe wanted, but yeah, that kind of frustrates me.
I think it's valid.
In Miami, I had a roommate, and I was trying to convince the guy to go electric, and he's like, gas is pretty cheap right now. He's like, I'm spending $30 a week. It's not bad. I'm not against it, but this isn't bad, you know? And it's the guy's like 25 years old, and you're just kind of like, no, but it's got, you know, but he's like, this is a pretty good price, just like your friend. And they're paying the petrol. And so there's still kind of that, I don't know, there's the inertia. And if it's, we talked about people, someone mentioned on your panel, voting with their wallet, right? We know that's a big problem in the industry, right? But when it's just kind of good enough for a lot of people as is, they're not going to be incentivized to change, right?
Yeah. Most people are not thinking about buying a new car or changing it. Like, they got millions of other things that they're doing. You've got to make it an economical choice, and the policy doesn't quite point that way, I think, at the moment.
Yeah.
Amazing. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us again and sharing again your most recent experience and some of the interesting projects that you're working on at BloombergNEF. Thanks very much, and look forward to reading and seeing some more of your articles on the topic as the year progresses.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Really nice.
Cheers, Ryan. Thank you.